ויאמר אדוני אל אברהם, לך לך מארצך וממולדתך ומבית אביך אל הארץ אשר אראך, ואעשך לגוי גדול, ואברכך ואגדלה שמך, והיה ברכה.
Lech Lecha, go by yourself, is the title of our weekly Torah portion for today. Again, understanding of this title is impossible without considering the prehistory of what actually happened to Abraham and how it came into being. Genesis chapter 11 talks about the generations of Noah and talks about them in a very specific manner. It chooses one member from each generation to represent it. Many rabbis believe that these particular men, Shem, Arphaxad, Selah, and others, did not participate in the construction of the Tower of Babel. They lived in the lower Mesopotamia in the area of Ur the Chaldean. The Chaldean nation was a part of the larger Aramaic nation which populated the entire Middle East. Particularly, according to Abraham Mamelat, the modern Israeli scholar, there were two distinct Aramaic clans, the northern and the southern. The southern ones were called Chaldeans, and they exist even unto the time of Nebuchadnezzar, while the northern ones are called Syrians. And in fact, in Hebrew, they are called Aram. The Syrians are called Aram. But these two clans represented the Aramean nation, and the southern one, called Chaldeans, the word comes from the Akkadian Kaldu or Kashda, which means the star, which makes many Middle Eastern scholars today suspicious of the fact that Chaldeans were astrologers. That was probably the reason behind why Abraham and his father Terach have left Ur the Chaldean. But Terach receives a very important assignment. God sends Terach and his family into the new land completely, into the land of Canaan, which is way far west from the Mesopotamia, on the eastern seaboard of Mediterranean, and is located in a very important geographical region. The region which represents the crossroad between old ancient trade routes. If you want to go from Hittite Empire to Egypt, or from Egypt into Assyria or Babylonia, you will pass by the land of Canaan. God wanted his people to settle in the middle of the well-known ancient Near Eastern world. And Terach left. But Terach and his family were pretty much wealthy family, and they had a flock to take care. That was their net worth. And in order to take care of such a net worth, it requires to have sufficient supply of pastures and water. This is why Terach was going along the route of Euphrates River, passing the regions populated by Babylonians and Sumerians, which was foreign for him, of course. Because of that, Terach was afraid to cross. By the way, that was a very ancient route which was only possible way to cross into the land of Canaan, because the Jordanian desert was impossible for the caravans with donkeys, and of course having sheep and goat. It's definitely a problem. This is why Terach was moving along the river Euphrates until he reached Haran, populated by the northern Aramean tribes, the Syrians, and remained there. Agada talks about the life of Terach as an idolatry. In other words, somewhere along the way, Terach has apostatized from God and became idol worshiper. And this what was a problem. This is why Terach did not complete the command of God. Agada talks about Abraham rejecting his father's idolatry, and that is probably the reason why God says to Abraham, Lech Lecha, go by yourself. Go forth. Go by yourself from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. This is something new. Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 5 says that Abraham was wandering Aramean. That was the nation to which Abraham and his ancestors belonged to. But now God promises to form from Abraham another nation, another people. And Abraham crosses Euphrates. This is why in the book of Genesis chapter 13, verse 14, it says, in chapter 14, verse 13, it says that Abraham is the Hebrew. The word Hebrew, English word Hebrew, derives from the word Ivri. Ivri comes from the verbal root avar. Avar means to cross over. That's what the new nation was initially called. Abraham the Hebrew. This Torah portion talks about the lives of Abraham. Abraham, who is called the founding pillar of the Jewish nation. This is how Midrash puts it. 10 generations before Noah and 10 generations after Noah has reaped the wrath of God. But Abraham came and took the reward of them all. This may be a little bit overstretched, because we know that among the 10 generations before Noah and after Noah were people like Noah himself, like Enoch, like Methuselah, and others who were righteous followers of God. But Abram is considered a pillar. Another Agada says that when somebody builds the house and erects the roof, there is a beam which is foundational for the roof. Abraham is that beam. The importance of Abraham is extremely, extremely treasured in the Jewish tradition. Abraham is the beginning, Abraham is the end. Abraham is an ideal. At some point, the rabbis believe that because Abraham is called the friend of God, and we will see that in the Haftarah, that he is called there a friend of God, Abraham is always righteous and never sins and never falls. The parasha shows a little bit differently. Abraham's life is like a hilly road. There are down times and up times. Yes, in his up time, Abraham crossed the river Euphrates, and because of that, he was able to establish himself as the originator of a new nation. But right after the crossing of the river, he faced the problem. The land which he came to was not watered by any large river like he is used to, Euphrates. In fact, God specifically wanted Abraham and his descendants to live in a region which was not watered by neither Nile nor by Tigris and Euphrates. Could God settle Abraham in Mesopotamia or in Egypt? Surely he could, but he didn't. God wanted his people to learn to depend upon him who sends the water from above. And that's how the ground becomes saturated and fruitful. And he wanted his people to see his actions face to face every year. Abraham wasn't used to such condition, and that's why he kept journeying down south and got himself into the troubles with Pharaoh. After realizing his mistake, he comes back to Bethel, where his altar was, and calls upon the name of God. Again, the uptime starts, and he enters into the battle with Kedorlaomer, the kings from Mesopotamia who came to ravage the land of Canaan, and he overcomes the enemy which outnumbered him. He returns his tithe to Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Interestingly enough, that wasn't the uptime turned down again. And in chapter 15, we see Abraham struggling with the fact that he doesn't have a posterity of his own, and he is ready to adopt his servant Eliezer from Damascus to become the inheritor of his estate. Eliezer was a good man. Abraham came from Haran with a number of people who supported him in his worship of true God, the Aramean people. But God had his plan for Abraham. And that's why he is entering into the covenant. He establishes the covenant for Abraham in chapter 15, which he does very uniquely by mimicking the Hittite ritual of creating the covenant between senior and vassals, under which the vassal walks between the cut carcasses of the donkeys with a promise, thus and thus your gods will do to me if I break your covenant. Abraham cuts the pieces of the animals, not the donkeys, but the clean animals, and doesn't have to walk through them. It was God who walks through them as the guarantor of the covenant. But after these experience, the decline happens. And a story of Hagar and the birth of Ishmael, whose consequences we feel even today. Somebody on a television once said, what was the way to avoid September 11? A huge commission was appointed, which worked for over a year and a half to determine the possibility of avoiding this disaster. The answer was very easy. Abraham shouldn't have slept with Hagar. After that, if you look at the time, God did not appear to Abraham for 13 years. But nevertheless, God's promises haven't changed. God did appear to Abraham with another command: to circumcise his flesh. That circumcision eventually leads to the event of the birth of Isaac. Why is the circumcision? That's very debatable in many scholarly circles. Some people believe that circumcision was common in Egypt and in other surrounding areas. But what is clear from the context of the Torah is that the family value is very important. Particularly, what we see in the Torah is the fact that the wrong marriage can cause such a disaster as the flood. Of course, in the ancient Near East, the man is the initiator of the marriage. In fact, the man goes to the father of the bride and signs the marriage contract. Later on, we see how Abraham is specifically concerned about the destiny and marriage of Isaac. Some Christian theologians equate the circumcision with the baptism, and that is wrong. According to the Gospels, the person who is going for baptism has to be taught. According to the Torah, the circumcision is performed by the parents on the 8th day after the birth of a child. In other words, the circumcision is the act which is performed by the parents upon their sole responsibility. Later on, in the story about Moses and Zipporah, we will find how Zipporah forgets to circumcise her children, the sons of Moses, and how God appears to her in a desert and fights with her and Moses until she does it. The circumcision is the act of the parents that promise to God to rear their child to the point of right marriage. And that's what God is showing as the response to Abraham's sleeping with Hagar. When Abraham has broken the bonds of his marriage and slept with another woman. Of course, in the Jewish tradition, Abraham is not considered adulterous, just because, according to the rabbinic tradition, adultery is the crime that is made by a woman. Not according to the 10 Commandments, to the Decalogue that says in the 7th commandment, Lo tinof, thou shalt not commit adultery. Tinof here is a second person masculine, not lo tinefi. That would be a feminine. And if sleeping with another woman is not an adultery, then what is adultery? Of course, in the norms of the ancient Near East, and in many marriage contracts which were recovered in Mesopotamia, that option is available for the childless couple. And it particularly says in a contract that if Mrs. doesn't bear a child, then she will take her maidservant and give the maidservant to a Mr., and the child that is born from that cohabitation becomes de facto the child and the inheritor of the family estate until Mrs. bears. And then, of course, there is a rearrangement. But that wasn't the plan of God. And Abraham struggled with his faith a little bit. Yeah, he was a man of faith. He made his step. He followed the commandment of God, and God was faithful in his promise by making his ends and by making the nation out of him. But Abraham wasn't a perfect, sinless man like all of us. Abraham was human. Abraham needed God. This is why Haftarah, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 41, which starts talking about Abraham, actually exalts God. This portion of the book of Isaiah is very important. It follows a very, very tragic prediction which Isaiah makes in his chapter 39, where he predicts the Babylonian captivity. Chapter 40 starts with the idea of consolation. Consolation of Israel that received double portion for his misdeeds. And chapter 41 is talking about Abraham. That's why rabbis chose this passage as a haftarah that corresponds with Isaiah, with Parasha Lech Lecha. Who has arose one from the east, whom he calls in righteousness to his feet? He delivers up the nation before him and subdues king. He makes them like dust with his sword and the wind-driven chaff with his bow. This is how the Haftarah passage describes the one who stands behind Abraham and gives him the victory over his enemies. Abraham wasn't righteous by his own. Yes, it says in the parasha, Abraham believed in God and it was reckoned to him as his righteousness. But Abraham was not the one who became righteous by himself. God was the one who was Abraham's righteousness. God was behind all good deeds of Abraham. And God was faithful in what he did during the consummation of his covenant. He led Abraham through his life. And this is why, when in the book of John, the discussion starts between Jesus and a Pharisee, the person of Abraham comes into play. The book of John often is considered as anti-Semitic book. But I don't believe that John was anti-Semitic, because first of all, he was a Jew. But John was raising an issue, a very important issue. The issue which is one of the most crucial issues in the entire gospel. The main source of conflict of the gospel is the meaning of Abraham. Pharisees believed that Abraham is the beginning. Jesus said in verse 51, before Abraham was born, I am. That is the main source of contention between Jesus and Pharisees. Because Pharisees know very well what the Haftarah says. Pharisees knew very well that the only one who could be bigger than Abraham was God himself, who rose him from the east. Of course, by Jesus making a statement like this, it was a blasphemy to their ears. But nevertheless, it was acknowledged that God was the only source of Abraham's strength and the only source and guarantor of his righteousness.